Good morning, everyone. I'm Cindy Yarnson, the director of the Latin American program. A real pleasure to welcome you to this very important discussion on Chinese finance in Latin America. The strategic competition between China and the United States globally is a major story about the international world order. It also has enormous repercussions in the Americas. Just a few weeks ago, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and other senior US officials traveled to Brazil and Argentina, and part of the motivation for that trip, of course, was the concern that those countries were discussing the development of their 5G infrastructure with the Chinese company Huawei. The story of China's trade relationship with the hemisphere, the demand for commodities, raw materials, as well as food, is one that is well known and played a critical role in the boom years of the first decade of the 2000s, in which the middle class in Latin America expanded and the number of people in poverty were reduced. This story is well known. And China's financing of large infrastructure projects in Latin America is also a long-standing trend. And that has led people in the United States, US officials and others concerned about China's role globally to claim that China is drowning Latin American countries in debt, with the potential that ultimately China will take over physical assets when countries are unable to pay. We are going to be discussing in detail the issue of Chinese financing. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Kaplan, a former fellow of the Wilson Center, an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, whose new book, Globalizing Patient Capital, the Political Economy of Chinese Finance in the Americas, serves as an anchor for today's discussion. We'll be looking at questions of how China's long-term risk tolerance and the lack of policy conditionality, the kind of conditionality that is characteristic of Western lenders and international financial institutions, has allowed developing countries, Latin American countries, to sidestep the fiscal austerity and other forms of governance conditionality insisted on in the West. In Latin America, we'll be asking what have been the effects of China's state-led capitalism, the costs and benefits of a state-based versus a market-based model or approach to development. And finally, we'll ask the question about how China's so-called patient capital, a term that Stephen has coined, how does this affect governance and related issues of transparency in the Americas, of course, a longstanding challenge. How will China's leaders react to the ongoing struggles in Latin America with questions of debt and dependency? As has been our privilege often in the Latin American program, we have a panel de lujo, a first-rate group of scholars to discuss these questions. Stephen Kaplan will go first. As I mentioned, at George Washington University, also a former fellow of the Wilson Center and also a current global fellow. He will be followed by Francisco Ordinez, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Political Science at the Catholic University in Chile, who joins us now from Santiago. Next will be Barbara Stallings, whose work on China-Latin America is some of the foundational work, especially concerning Japan's relationship with the region, which was, I think, the first attention paid to Asia's role in Latin America when Barbara was among a handful of people looking at the role of Japan in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. Barbara is a research professor at Brown University and is also affiliated with Tsinghua University in China. And finally, we will hear from Xiaoyu Pu, who is an associate professor at the University of Nevada in Reno, very close to the fires in Lake Tahoe, from what I understand, and I hope that you and your family and your colleagues are staying safe and breathing good enough air. Xiaoyu grew up in China and has spent obviously many years in the United States, and will, I think, help us understand these dimensions, not only from a US or a Latin American, but also from a Chinese perspective. I would invite people who are in the audience who have questions to please send them to our Twitter account, which is at LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, and we will take as many of them as we can in the discussion period. So Stephen, first, over to you, and I would certainly like to thank my colleague, Oscar Cruz, who has joined us for this session, our wonderful colleagues in the audiovisual team at the Wilson Center, my colleague Benjamin Gadan, Deputy Director of the Latin American Program, who was also very knowledgeable about China and Latin America, and finally just put in a plug for a series that we have commissioned since the beginning of the pandemic on China's and US competition over so-called mask diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, a series of essays you can find on our website. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for the support of the Wilson Center for this project. Thank you to Cindy, thank you to Benjamin. Thank you to the Latin American Program, the Kissinger Institute, and the Brazil and Mexico Institute as well. I'm going to share my slides with you, so bear with me one moment here. And I will be presenting sort of excerpts from my book and then pivoting to kind of talk about sort of Latin American, Chinese finance and Latin American in a current context as well. So if we start out and we look at the financial relationship globally, China as a global creditor, you could see the importance of the global financial crisis in 2008. China had a long-standing relationship through trade with Latin America, beginning during the decade after joining the WTO. But it was really sort of the global financial crisis that we see China increasing its financial profile, its banking profile globally and particularly in Latin America. You can see prior to the global financial crisis, as a creditor, it's fairly close to where Brazil was. You can see as this trend line goes up, it's now one of the top 5 banking creditors internationally. So this then begs the question of how does China's finance compare to these other sources of finance historically? Now, this book is embedded in a literature about globalization. And very briefly, I just want to highlight that this literature historically really emphasizes private capital. And the tendency, particularly during cyclical downturns, for that private capital to at times flow out of the country, right? Increasing pressure on governments in order to implement austerity, sometimes closing the room that national governments have to maneuver. But a key assumption of this literature is that that capital is private. What this new sort of increase in Chinese financing globally, this now raises the question, what happens if instead of that capital being private, we have an increase in kind of state-led capital? Does it change these parameters at all? And so this is sort of the genesis for the idea of China's patient capital, right? That effectively, compared to this private financing that might have a quick trigger and be apt to leave countries during cyclical downturns, China's patient capital is more likely to have a longer term horizon, more risk tolerance, and less policy conditionality. We'll get into more of that right now. First of all, we have other bilateral lenders too, and multilateral lenders that tend to have a long-term profile. China's average maturity of loans is usually about 17 years. Now, compared to the private sources of capital I just mentioned that are closer to kind of 5 years, you can see this extension of the horizon is really key. And the scale, right? So compared to a lot of other bilateral lenders, why we care about China is the scale of financing that they've committed to Latin America in particular since the global financial crisis. It also reflects infrastructure financing. we think of periods of austerity in Latin America, particularly throughout the 1990s, when cuts to budgets were made, it was often in infrastructure, right? So there was an infrastructure deficit where this long-term financing is very appealing to Latin American borrowers. Chinese financing also tends to have a higher risk tolerance. Why? Well, Chinese creditors can gain cheap assets, market share, right? And sort of more commercial opportunities by having this cheap infrastructure financing come in, right? As Barber and others have highlighted through their work previously as well, is that compared to the atomized nature of finance in the West, you tend to have big package financing from China that cuts across multiple dimensions. And this infrastructure financing is meant to stimulate trade, FDI, all other types of commercial opportunities. Of course, risk appetite isn't limitless, but it is a tool, right, in order to create and expand market share for Chinese firms internationally. Just as an example, you can see here, we have downturns in Brazil, global financial crisis, the commodity downturn, the corruption, the Lava Jato corruption scandal as well. During each of these scandals, we see foreign direct investment, Chinese investment in Brazil growing, right? So they're taking advantage of these opportunities to purchase cheap assets. Now, I mentioned compared to kind of conditionality, where you often get such things as budget discipline, privatization, decentralization, right? All these sort of, classic tenets of the Washington Consensus that might be attached to lending. Instead, right, it's not that Chinese lending is unconditional, but oftentimes we get a commercial conditionality instead, meaning finance is instead secured to loans collateralized by future commodity deliveries, guaranteed contracts with Chinese firms, contractors, and suppliers, and commitments to buy Chinese machinery. So where the lending historically from Western financing tends to be very market-oriented and macro-oriented towards macroeconomic policy, the Chinese financing tends not only to be focused on infrastructure, but also commercial conditions, more of the microeconomic type of conditions surrounding this financing. So we can see that this has grown over time as well. This is a share of a country's external financing in Latin America on average. You can see historically bonds have accounted for a lot of that, but now today Chinese bank loans account for a lot larger share than it did prior to the global financial crisis in 2008, and about equivalent as a share of GDP to multilateral loans. So this now sort of begs the question, okay, what does that mean from a policymaking standpoint? Well, in the book, I highlight the difference between state-to-state loans and market-oriented loans, right? We hear a lot in the news of China's sort of state-led capitalism, infrastructure financing at a state-to-state level, but it also occurs, right, in sort of competitive bidding in order to finance bids of Chinese firms as well. And that's more market-oriented loans. But as you can see in this graph, a lot of the lending historically has been state-to-state loans. So part of what I want to look at is what's the cost and benefits of the structure of this kind of financing. So we can look at a tale of two projects very quickly, right? You have state-to-state projects in Argentina, such as the hydropower stations in Santa Cruz, where direct contracting with Chinese firms, essentially direct contracting with Chinese banks, right, was allowed, right? But there needed to be a state guarantee of the loan. And so in exchange for that state guarantee of the loan, right, obviously you have the national government then increasing its potential liabilities over the long run. But at the same time, right, you get China saying, okay, if we're not going to hedge the risk with policy conditionality, we have to do this somehow, hence commercial conditions, right? So you see a quarter of the loan needs to be paid towards Chinese machinery and equipment. Comparatively, you have a private procurement channel, right? This is an example of the Cauchari Solar Park. Here, you have a privately managed auction system. Chinese financing comes in directly to finance sort of equity, a stake, right, in the winning bid here. You don't have the same level of state indebtedness. And there's a lot more transparency, right? There needed to be local community consent, and local employees need to receive training to work in constructions operations, right? So there's this aim to try to expand local content simultaneously. So what I want to do in sort of the remaining few minutes here is kind of look at what are some of the costs and benefits, right? So we'll go through sort of a graphical tour quickly and kind of assessing what Chinese financing allows Latin American governments to have and what are some of the costs of it. So very quickly, you can see an advantage here. This is Latin American budget balances in Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Venezuela. You can see even in these countries, which were left of center at the time, you essentially see that there are budgetary surpluses right up to the 2008 global financial crisis. As Chinese credit expands in blue there, we see an increase in Latin American budget deficits simultaneously. So essentially, where a natural Keynesian response to a downturn of spending money would be expected, it is sustained, perhaps, right, due to, or what I sort of, my theoretical prior is that the lack, right, of China's emphasis on policy conditionality allows these countries to have more room to maneuver in terms of spending money and having budget deficits. Now, if it goes through the market channel I just highlighted, where it flows directly to enterprises in order to support commercial projects, you instead see less of that expansion, right? Here's an example of a null case with Brazil. Chinese financing has come into Brazil. However, since it's flowing more through this market private procurement channel, you still have a big emphasis on austerity in Brazil historically. You have sort of a constitutional spending cap that's been implemented, all in the framework, right, of having sort of these Chinese loans flowing to private procurement, right? The counterfactual would be if it went right to the state, that would open up more degrees of maneuverability theoretically for Brazil. So when we talk about this commercial conditionality, what are we thinking about? Well, there are tools for promoting Chinese commerce, bilateral tied aid, Chinese foreign content, commercial interest rates, currency promotion of the renminbi. But there's also tools for managing sovereign risk. If you're not going to have policy conditionality, you got to hedge your risk somehow. China does this through administrative channels, commodity guarantees or commodity-backed loans, cross-default clauses, and state-backed commercial insurance, right? So they have a lot of tools to hedge their risk, but primarily this is done through commodity guarantees and land guarantees, very similarly to what China had done domestically with their economic model. Here's a quick glimpse of a cross-default clause in one of these contracts, basically tying projects together within a nation, right? If China is trying to expand its share of markets abroad, it's trying to do that across, right, the country in a variety of different projects. And so it links these projects together. So if one project gets stalled, that will immediately sort of stall other projects in the region as well. So we see sort of commercial hedges, use of tools like default risk instead, cross default clauses instead. We also see, right, compared to, right, I just highlighted in the earlier graph, you tend to have less policy conditionality, more room to maneuver, greater ability to spend. But on the reverse side, you get more commercial conditionality with Chinese loans. Here you can see number 2 represents, right, we see on this bottom axis, Chinese commercial conditions. The 2 represents commodity-backed loans, right, greater number of conditions, greater number of these more financial hedge kind of conditions. We can see this grows with state-to-state contracts, right? So that's how they're hedging the risk instead. We can also see it in this graph here. As China's state-to-state financing expands, China's commercial conditions also expand in countries as well. So what does this mean ultimately? Well, there becomes very important questions in terms of industrial diversification, commodity dependency, and growing levels of debt. While the region may benefit from cheaper forms of credit and infrastructure financing, at the same time, you see there's been greater capital inputs bought of Chinese products, right? High-tech manufacturing imports from the United States, you see in this graph, as well as China. You see since the global financial crisis, those high-tech imports, right? Telecommunications and other things have expanded quite rapidly, right? So this raises the question, to what extent is China's purchases of commodities and infrastructure financing that's guaranteed by commodities reinforce commodity dependency and inhibit an expansion into industrial diversification. Similarly, you can see here, in terms of commodity dependence, Latin America's primary commodity exports to China, right, have grown over the course of the last several decades, but we don't really see much growth in terms of manufacturing goods exports to China, right? So one of the key complaints of Latin American countries in terms of this relationship, notwithstanding the cheap financing, is we should have greater complementarities. We should have greater value added opportunities through these relationships. And finally, there's a question of indebtedness, right? So the extent to which, right, we actually, Cindy just opened up talking about debt trap diplomacy, this notion of expanding cheap financing in order to have greater gains in equity and assets over the long run. I would suggest the motivations of China have been a bit different. They've, yes, expanded in order to take advantage of commercial opportunities and grow market share in sectors like energy in Latin America. But I suggest it's been a learning curve for China, right? The extent to which, right, some investments have not paid off in places like Venezuela, that has not been by design, right? And, right, they're kind of forced in this posture of restructuring and renegotiation that wouldn't necessarily be their preferred state. So you could see, for example, in the red here, we have China's share of Venezuelan's foreign debt. Certainly, that share has expanded over time, but you can also see that the indebtedness problem in Venezuela has not only been a Chinese problem. There's a lot of other actors, including Wall Street, that were purchasing Venezuelan assets even after the commodity downturn. And so what we can see here, though, in this final graph about indebtedness is essentially that what China has done instead is say, okay, we'll try to secure our lending, right, with purchases, essentially having local exporters of oil send oil to Chinese importers. Then the proceeds are put into an account and ideally, right, can be used to pay off this debt. But what you see happening with these linkages, right, to oil in terms of repaying debt is that increasingly in the red here, a larger share of oil in Venezuela, or places like Venezuela, as well as Ecuador, has to be committed to repaying these loans. So effectively, the amount countries have then to reinvest in their oil sector gets shrunk over time as they have more and more liabilities building. So where does that leave us ultimately moving forward is that China too realizes that, okay, to some extent in doing sort of these interviews I did in China as well as Latin America, there's sort of an understanding that, okay, given the 2014 commodity downturn, given the COVID pandemic, right, China's trying to use a diversified incremental strategy in Latin America. So it's not just state-to-state financing. We've seen them expand other forms of financing, including state-backed equity, right, trying to grow these funds that would invest directly in corporate enterprises at lower amounts compared to this very big, large state-to-state investments. So that's one thing we're seeing more of, as well as using more of this market channel that relies directly on foreign direct investment or sort of private bidding or open bid, private procurement within Latin American countries. And the final thing we're seeing is a greater reliance upon multilateralism. Not only the emergence of new banks like the AIB multilaterally, but also seeing China doing more and more through the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank as partners, and using this multilateral strategy as a way to gain legitimacy and also hedge their previous exposure. So with that, I leave you with the following commentary, which is in some ways, I think, really representative of Chinese situation currently in Latin America. It's an old saying from John Maynard Keynes: owe your banker 1,000 pounds and you're at his mercy. Owe him 1 million pounds and the position is reversed. And thus, after extending a lot of these state-to-state loans in Latin America, we're now seeing China in a posture of restructuring, renegotiating places like Ecuador, Argentina, and elsewhere in order to try to recover their arrears in terms of payments, et cetera, as well. A position that's quite similar to commercial banks historically in the region, too. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing everyone's comments and questions.
Stephen, thanks so much for that overview. Francisco, you're up.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for the invitation. I've read your book, Stephen, with lots of interest. I have a lot of comments. I would like to take your last point, which is, to me, the most interesting contribution of this wonderful book, which is the huge heterogeneity, the diversification, what you said, the diversified incremental strategy by Chinese banks. I think that the book shows very well how state-led capitalism works, and also the learning curve of China's creditors, as well, of course, as the learning curve of Latin American countries in dealing with Chinese credit. So I met Stephen in 2013. He doesn't know this because he probably don't remember me, but he has been working on this book for many years. Back then, he was carrying out interviews in Brazil. And as a master's student, I happened to join one of these interviews as an assistant. And that was the first time I heard on the role of, for example, what became the New Development Bank founded by BRICS countries in 2014. It was already a few discussions on the Belt and Road Initiative. Eventually, the AIIB was founded in 2015, but back then we still didn't understand how China's finance was working in Latin America, and Stephen was already carrying out research on this issue. So I was looking forward to this book very much. And what he shows, as he said, is that there are two stories with regard of how Chinese banks lend. We have a story of the state-to-state channel, which probably is the one which captures most our attention, because it has to do with the relaxation of the impossible trilemma, on the differentiation between policy conditionalities and commercial conditionalities. And as he says, well, the Chinese banks, mainly the two main policy banks, the China Development Bank and China's Exim Bank, maximize markets, not profits. And that by itself, it's a very interesting story. But then there's another story which is very interesting, which is the incremental role of finance through private procurement systems, where national governments have little room for government spending discretion. And I think this is very interesting because it brings lessons to people interested in other regions as well. For instance, I have seen this trend also in finance by the AIIB in Asia. And as he mentions, countries which implement PPP frameworks tend to take the most from Chinese finance. And I think that also it's very clear in the book that China's banks are starting to prefer this sort of strategy. Perhaps the best example, the best within example, is the Argentinian one that Stephen mentioned, how one government went through a state-to-state strategy that financed the Santa Cruz hydropower stations, versus a different government which followed the private procurement system. And we have the Cauchari Solar Park as a success case for that. And this is to bring a comment that it's part of the book that I think it's very interesting, which is that Stephen mentions that commercial conditionality may be the Achilles heel of China's foreign economic policy, especially looking to the Belt and Road Initiative as a large framework based on state-to-state lending. What the Latin American case shows us is that countries which chose or preferred the state-to-state channel, such as Ecuador, are starting to doubt over the merits of China's finance on its impact on development strategies. On the contrary, countries which have opted for Chinese finance through private procurement systems are taking the most of it, and particularly in the renewables energy sector. And I found that fascinating, really. There are other points that we can discuss further after these comments. The book provides novel data. I mean, there's been literature on China's finance in the region, but through what he calls the China Global Finance Index, he pretty much shows that it's important to measure credit through outstanding loan stocks, because it's very hard to disentangle what's promised and what countries actually do with that money. So yeah, overall, I think this is a terrific contribution, not only to the understanding of China's Latin American relations, but as I said earlier, to the current discussion on China's state capitalism and the implications of these tensions that we are seeing between a more state-to-state channel and a more private-to-state channel. I think there's a tension even within China with regards to those two strategies, and I found that absolutely interesting. So thank you, Stephen. I will stop here and perhaps continue my comments after the other participants finish.
Francisco, thanks so much. Barbara, over to you. And you have to unmute. There you go. Thanks.
The usual comment on all panels, you have to unmute. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this event. Stephen's excellent new book focuses on loans from China's policy banks to Latin American borrowers. He does a great job of explaining how these banks operate, specifically how they're different from Western bond markets with longer maturities, focus on infrastructure, higher risk tolerance, and micro rather than macro policy conditions. He also analyzes a particular type of impact in Latin America, fiscal space, or in non-technical terms, the ability to run deficits. I want to use my limited time this morning to complement his analysis by elaborating on 3 points. First, other types of China-Latin America relations that provide the context for thinking about policy bank loans. Second, problems deriving from these loans. And third, some policy lessons for Latin America. On other types of relations with China, trade is far and away the most important way in which China and Latin America interact. China is the most important trade partner for now about six Latin American countries, and the second most important for several others. The type of trade is very important to keep in mind. It mainly consists of exporting commodities from Latin America to China in return for the import of industrial goods. This pattern leads to many negative consequences for Latin American economies and societies, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into now. Stephen talked about this in terms of the middle income trap. Foreign direct investment. In quantitative terms, FDI is more important than policy bank loans, especially in the last few years. Chinese FDI reinforces the characteristics of trade relations and tends to involve mergers and acquisitions rather than greenfield investments. That is, China wants to buy successful going firms rather than build from scratch. The latter would be much more valuable for Latin America. And finally, politics. While China has not tried to exercise the type of political leverage that was so prevalent in the 19th and 20th centuries, first by Europe and then by the United States, political relations can't be forgotten. Certainly in other regions of the world, China has used political and economic pressure on its partners. And in general, it's become more aggressive recently. Many of you will have heard the term wolf warrior diplomacy. Moving on to problems with policy bank loans, I want to reinforce some of the things that Stephen mentions and add some others. On the positive side, China's policy banks provide large amounts of capital for investment, which is definitively beneficial. But these loans also create lots of different kinds of problems. Stephen discusses one set of problems in detail, what he calls commercial or macro conditions, that is Latin American and other borrowers, because this is not unique to Latin America. Latin American and other borrowers must purchase equipment from Chinese lenders, what we used to call tied aid in the olden days. Also, the Chinese frequently use commodity guarantees, such as pledging oil for loans to safeguard their money. But there are also other kinds of problems that I want to add in here. For instance, there are often environmental problems with infrastructure projects financed by China. Evidence shows that Chinese projects are even more environmentally unfriendly than projects financed by their Western countries or multilateral agencies. Employment creation from Chinese projects is limited, partly because of the use of Chinese labor, and inputs from local Latin American firms are also limited. There is a lack of transparency and the existence of corruption with respect to projects financed by Chinese policy banks. Lack of transparency and corruption can lead to problems with quality. China promotes itself as being cheap and fast in implementing projects compared to other lenders, but this can create problems of quality, especially when combined with corrupt relations between local governments and Chinese lenders. Like FDI, policy bank loans tend to reinforce the commodity specialization of exports and undermine local industries in Latin America. And they enable deficits, which is Stephen's main focus. It can be good to have fiscal space, but this assumes that the respective governments are going to use the money wisely. Otherwise, deficits only cause problems for everyone, as can be seen most vividly in the case of Venezuela. I want to end with 6 policy suggestions for Latin America with respect to the region's relations with China. First, seek diversification of external relations. Don't become dependent on China. Do business with China, yes, but simultaneously expand relations with the United States, with Europe, and with other parts of Asia. Second, make demands. Don't just accept offers. Be clear what is specifically desired from China, either from the point of view of an individual country, or preferably a group of countries that can negotiate jointly with China. Set the rules for the environment in which China operates. And above all, don't get caught in the conflict between China and the United States. Third, keep the broad context in mind. Trade, FDI, various kinds of loans, not just policy bank loans, and possible political pressures are all part of the new and growing relationships between Latin America and China. All have both positive and negative aspects that need to be understood. Fourth, demand transparency. China is notorious for not providing data on amounts and conditions on its loans. The academic result is that those studying these loans have had to create their own databases, as Stephen did. The practical result is that lack of transparency can open the door to corruption. Fifth, understand China and its way of doing business. And Stephen's book is very useful here. As he explains, China operates in very different ways than the ways we're used to in terms of China's Western counterparts. And finally, invest Chinese money wisely. Each Latin American borrower should keep in mind its own long-term development goals, as well as potential debt problems when it accepts loans from China's policy banks. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Barbara. That was crystal clear. And if you have a written copy of those remarks that you would allow us to put up on the web, I think the audience would be very interested in having a copy. Xiaoyu, it is your turn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. So first I will congratulate Steve for finishing this book. I'll say a few words about the book, and then I will raise some broader comments about the broader policy implications of this research for China, for Latin America, for the United States. So number one, I think this book is so ambitious. So I remember I talked to Steve many years ago. He was talking about, he was writing this book. I feel, oh, this is not one book. It looks like two books because on the one hand, this book analyzed China's economic statecraft, focused on pension capital in all the details. On the other hand, the book really provided very much solid analysis of how that impact situation policy on the ground in Latin America. Conventionally, this, in terms of the scale, it could be two books. But of course, there's a clear thesis. The book is very coherent, but I think it's very, very ambitious, very important. Second is that this book challenged many sort of like popular narratives in the media about China's economic statecraft, China's interactions in many developing world. I think it challenged some of the narratives in the media and provided much more nuanced stories. Certainly, I think the book really in terms of empirical research, in terms of methodology, it's a model, especially for young scholars. It has multi-method design. It has rich empirical evidence, both based on big data analysis, but also the elite interviews, very much, very impressive. Hundreds of interviews on the ground in Latin America, travel to China many times. I think this book is really a model. So for that's my brief comments about the book. Then I will focus some comments about the broader implications, how this book or the research help us understand China, Latin America, even some policy implications for the United States. Number one, for China, I think now in terms of policy and narrative, we see increasingly a dominant narrative about China is that China has a coherent greater strategy to even compete or even replace the United States as a global leader. Either that's the narrative about the Thucydides trap or the 100 years marathon, or the recent a new book by Doshi, the long game, right? All talking about China has a coherent greater strategy. But some people say, okay, in Washington, D.C., the debate is over. Okay, that's the the United States perception of China's long-term intention. But in the broader academic world, debates, discussions are still going on. We see a more sort of fragmented China. We see sort of like the narrative about the fragmented authoritarianism. Also, we see China's policymaking reflects this kind of modeling through characteristics, feature, modeling through, not like there's a a clear long-term strategy. And some study about BRI also emphasize domestic bargaining. And so one thing I think implications for Steve's book, I was wondering is that looks like on the one hand, the book talk about the pension capital. This fits the narrative about like long-term coherence grad strategy, but also in details, Steve also talk a lot about the bargaining, domestic processes, different actors. So I think that's kind of interesting. So maybe there's no definite answer. I think in a broader sense, the debate about China's foreign policy process, China's long-term intention, I think should still go on. I think especially related to Steve's talking about like China's diversified strategy, I think that reflect there's some sort of learning process. My own opinion is that even in today's China, there are internal debates, discussions, whether, I mean, Chinese policymakers, they worry about overstretching problems, they worry about the risk associated with all these investment, overseas investment. I think there could be also nuanced story. I think Steve's book really sort of could fit into this kind of debate between these two narratives, coherent China versus fragmented China debate. The second broad comment is about so what for Latin America countries. So on the one hand, I agree with Steve that there's a distinction between policy conditions and commercial conditions. China definitely does not provide like Washington consensus style package, like all these policy conditions. And also China does not want to like a regime change. So in that sense, very much different from some of the Western policymakers' approach. But on the other hand, I also think China have political conditions or even preconditions, I would say. I mean, given the issues like Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, those issues are very much quote unquote sensitive issue in the eyes of Chinese policymakers. So if assuming any of the Latin American leaders, maybe Brazilian president receive a call from Taiwan's president, then the political conditions or precondition will show up. So, but most of these Latin American countries probably do not have like a severe political disputes with China. So that I think means, but that means China focus on these commercial conditions. But if these Latin American countries, if they have like a high dependency on China, if political crisis happen between the two countries, then the political conditions will shape the relationship. And also a very quick comment about non-interference. So I think Steve mentioned in his book, not in his presentation today. So China, of course, has this non-intervention policy in China's diplomacy. But I think Chinese leaders and policymakers, Chinese scholars now also rethinking about this. As I said, China does not want to have a regime change. In that sense, non-intervention policy is still there. But on the other hand, I talked to some of the Chinese scholars, policymakers, they say that, I mean, 1 billion investment, that's political, that's not just economic. So in a sense that they worry about all the political policy environment related to China's investment. So now they on the one hand, they try to stick to non-intervention policy, non-intervention policies. They don't like Western style intervention. But on the other hand, they want to shape the policy environment related to their investment. So some scholars propose some new idea like the creative involvement or something like that. So I think that China is also rethinking to some degree this non-intervention principle. That will have implications for countries like Latin America and other countries. The third comment about so what for the United States? I think the previous administration, the Trump administration, entirely describes China's involvement, presence in Latin America as sort of a zero-sum game. Now I think it's time we should have a sort of like a more nuanced understanding what's going on there. So it does not mean like every Chinese presence activities in Latin America should be a negative game or a zero-sum game versus the United States. But there are real competitions between the United States and China. So complain about China or labeling China's activity as debt trap diplomacy, that does not solve the problem. That does not. So ultimately, many Latin American countries, they have their own domestic politics. They have their own considerations, whether and how they engage China. So I think from US perspective, a much nuanced understanding of China and Latin America interactions is needed. So I think Steve's book exactly contributes to that kind of debate. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. I have a number of questions, but first I'd like to ask the panelists if they would like to respond to anything that someone else has said. Not just Stephen, but others who would like to add something. If not, I'll jump in. Stephen, go ahead, please, and unmute yourself. Thanks.
Sure, I'll be very quick so that we have more time for interaction, but I just want to flag some of the key things to maybe think of as we're moving forward in discussion. One by Francisco, the difference between the market and state channel moving forward and how China will hedge its risk moving forward in light of what Xiaoyu was just saying in terms of, okay, it's a mixed picture there. China's not monolithic, and it's dealing with sort of how to restructure some of the investments it's already had. And so even when I met with people from the banking industry in China and policy banks, there was concern about things like perpetual restructuring, right? What do you do? Hence the rethinking, right, out there of, well, how do we ensure, right, that our advice is taken, right? And there's definitely, through my interviews, even some frustration among the banking industry within China too, of giving advice, and then countries like Venezuela not taking the advice, right? And that is another element of sort of why I don't know if necessarily the debt trap diplomacy is the right way to think about it, because China itself is trying to think about, well, how do we get other countries to listen to us more, right? Meaning they had different intentions early on. Another point very quickly as well about, I think Barbara highlighted the trade-offs really well. You might get cheap infrastructure financing on one hand, but then not only commercial conditionality, but there are costs in terms of environmental and public transparency and things along these lines. So it's almost like a trade deal, right? Latin American governments need to take heed and really pay attention to negotiating over local content and the structure of the deal. So yes, terrific comments. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and other people's questions as well, Cindy.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Thanks to everybody. I'd like to remind people in the audience, if you have a question, please send it to our Twitter account at LatAmProg. First question, I think for you, Xiaoyu, because you opened up a theme that is not often talked about in the United States, and you characterized the US view of China as having this grand strategy and being a coherent actor versus the academic discussions of Chinese behavior around the world, as being much more fragmented, or that Chinese decision-making was fragmented. I was wondering if, with respect to Latin America in particular, if you can expand upon the sense of internal debates within China about the reliability of some of the investments that it's made. Stephen has referenced Venezuela, but I'm totally interested in that breaking down of China as a monolithic actor. And I have neglected, and thank you, Stephen, for reminding me, we are co-sponsoring this event with the Kissinger Institute on China, the United States, the Mexico Institute, and the Brazil Institute. And I know if my colleague, Robert Daly, were on the screen, he would very much be insisting on understanding these internal dynamics within China. So a first question to you, Xiaoyu, and any others who want to comment on internal debates within China.
Thank you, Cindy, for these questions. I actually have a forthcoming article with Margaret Myers about this, is that China's internal debate about strategic overstretching and how that impact China-Latin America relations. So just some brief examples. The idea overstretching, traditionally many strategic scholars use that to describe the problem for empires, established power. But in recent years, we noticed that even many Chinese scholars, policy advisors, they also realize as China rapidly expand its presence in many parts of the world, China might have the problem of so-called overstretching, strategic overstretching. So there are some sort of internal discussions, what that might mean for China's foreign policy more broadly, but also China's China-Latin America relations. So what we notice is that some Chinese policymakers, advisors, even Chinese leaders openly, they worry about some of the issues. So regarding like many of the issues, like Steve mentioned in his book, I think Chinese leaders also understand so many investments, in these countries that could generate political backlashes, also political risk, economic risk. So I think there's some sort of rethinking going on there in Beijing. So maybe some people remember a couple of years ago in the second international forum of BRI, Belt Road Initiative, Xi Jinping made a long speech. A part of his speech appeared to be like a response to all kinds of concerns, even criticism. Some people say, okay, maybe Trump administration served a role as a reviewer too. So in a sense, provide all the feedback, and the Chinese policymakers realize there are all kinds of potential backlashes, how to deal with that. So that's some sort of my observations. Yeah.
Great. My next question, Stephen and Barbara, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that. Stephen, go ahead.
Just a really quick comment to reinforce what Xiaoyu was saying is that so often the way grand strategy appears to be thought about, right, is that China is this monolith, right? And in a way, what I'm trying to do within the book is sort of argue for this nuance. But I think it's also really important from a policymaking standpoint, as Xiaoyu just highlighted, right, that China itself is an incrementalist in terms of foreign economic strategy too. They're seeing what happens. They're taking the feedback and trying to adjust, right? And hence the diversified tool structure that I was mentioning earlier. So I think it's very important to think about China as sort of a power that is also incremental and experimental and willing to change, right? Which I think is sometimes very different from the narrative we hear.
Great. My next question is for Barbara and for Francisco. Barbara, you mentioned in your summation of the lessons for Latin America of Chinese involvement that Latin American countries should be making more demands, not just taking offers, that they should seek diversification of partners. And so really the question for both you and Francisco is, what do you see as the learning curve in Latin America itself with respect to Chinese either lending, investments, even the trade relationship, which as many have described is heavily based on commodities for manufactured goods. What learning process is there in a region that has such enormous infrastructure needs, needs capital, does not necessarily want to accept a lot of the onerous conditionality of Western lenders? Where do you see that learning having taken place? I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
Francisco, you're in Latin America, so you should start.
All right. Yeah, I think there's definitely a learning curve with regards to how to deal with China. I think that policymakers have moved from a honeymoon in the early 2000s to a more cautious look, in which now there are both, there's an acknowledgement that there are both opportunities and concerns. One of them has to do with a certain backlash against China in general in public opinion. And another concern has to do with how China manages and uses what Stephen describes as commercial conditionalities to counteract obsolescence bargaining. So there's tensions here in how the patient capital works on the ground and how Latin American politics work, which is very short-term oriented. That creates tensions within governments and within countries, even among regions. I mean, there's something very interesting to mention, which is, and it's addressed in the book, subnational governments in Latin America have learned to deal with these actors jumping the state level agency. So provinces in federal countries are receiving finance, for example, from the Exim Bank. That's something that shows a very steep learning curve. Regional governments now have the staff, the knowledge, and the courage to ask for a credit from a Chinese policy bank, but that creates complexities. I think that what Latin American countries are seeing is that there are success cases, there are failed cases, and as Yao Yu mentioned, I think there was this expectation that China would know how to behave when things were not going as expected. And the truth is that that's not the case. China is also learning from this experience. So this is a case of two parts learning from each other. And what's being written recently, this book, Carl Zweig's book, for instance, to me shows that there are positive lessons and learning cases that we should take care of. And then there are some cases which are negative experiences from which we should learn what not to do. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the region with regards to China in the last years.
Let me take a slightly more negative view of this. I'm not sure that Latin America's learned that much at all. There is still a huge gap in knowledge on both sides, both the Chinese side and the Latin American side. But there's really not much learning, not much knowledge from the Latin American main actors. Language, culture, way that China does business, I think that there is very little learning that has gone on. There's certainly been some change, sometimes with the change in government, for example, from Macri to Fernandez, or in Ecuador. So those, is that learning, or is just a very different view? In the case of Argentina, a more positive view of China. In the case of Ecuador, a more negative view. Or when they're forced, like Bolsonaro. We all remember the Bolsonaro campaign, really anti-China, and he was forced to change because, hey, China is Brazil's biggest trade partner and one of its most important investors. So I would like to think that the Chinese or the Latin Americans are becoming more sophisticated. I'm not too sure. One sort of cautionary point, country that you're sitting in right now, Francisco, Chile. Chile was pretty hands-off for a very long time. And now suddenly, lots of Chinese investment going on in Chile, especially in the lithium area, which many Chilean officials did not want to have Chinese investment in lithium. China now controls almost the entire electricity distribution system in Chile. So there are lots of sort of cautionary notes is that learning, Jorge Heine would tell us that this is learning, that Chileans have learned that they should take advantage of China. I'm not so sure. One could say that things are being done to them as opposed to by them. Different view.
Great. Francisco, one of the things you said about a backlash in public opinion against China, and I'm not sure if you were referring to the Chilean case or to Latin America more generally, but do you get the sense, as is certainly the case in the United States, that political issues within China, vis-a-vis the crackdown in Hong Kong or treatment of Uyghurs or whatever, that that Chinese policies, internal policies, are a source of concern among citizens, not necessarily governments or state enterprises or private companies that are trying to do business with China, but in public opinion more generally, as they certainly are in the United States.
Yeah, I will be brief, but I think that in Latin America, there's not much knowledge. I agree with that, with Barbara, regarding China's domestic situation. I think that China's backlash has to do with, the Wilson Center has Daniela Campello now carrying out research on this specific topic. It has to do with the fact that China's economic might and China's economic statecraft has created dependency, and dependency has created, we could call it winners and losers within countries, depending on where people live, which activities do they perform. And there's this sense that China's spring, China's honeymoon was not equally capitalized by everybody. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I would add, Cindy, the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic itself has caused a major damage to China's reputation in Latin America. And I would say that currently the public opinion in general towards China, it's been in its worst level since it's being measured since the early 2000s.
Great. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. And if you give me a second, because my phone is just timed out. One from Javiera Garcia from BNA Americas, who has sent us a number of questions, but this one is particularly of interest. How much would a game changer be a free trade agreement between China and Uruguay, especially with how that would affect Mercosur? Again, we're going back to trade rather than loan, than finance and infrastructure investments. Does anybody want to comment on Uruguay's position now vis-a-vis a free trade agreement with China? If not, I can take another one from Henry Lohendorf, which has to do a question that crossed my mind as well. How is Chinese practice, offering loans in return for obligations to purchase products from China, any different than the way the United States gives grants, either of economic assistance or military equipment? I mean, there are these Buy American clauses. I mean, is China really doing anything different than the United States, or for that matter, other donors? Stephen, I see you have your hand up.
Great. I think this is where it's helpful to think about, the kind of commercial conditionality, as I mentioned before. I think there is a component where you have loans extended and the expectation is you use Chinese machinery and Chinese contracts, but that's, as Barbara was saying too earlier, very, in line with what we've seen in history in terms of tied aid. What's a little more different, we saw it from Japan earlier, in the region and elsewhere, but a lot larger in scale in today's world by China, is using commodity and loan guarantees, right, in order to secure the deal, these oil for loan contracts. And I think to speak to part of the discussion earlier and link this to part of the discussion earlier that we were having in terms of has the region learned or not, I think one of the reasons that maybe is inhibiting the region from learning that I can draw from the interviews I've done with policymakers is that there seems to be a difference between historically how the region has interacted with the United States, right, in terms of economic policy, and then how it is reacting with China. And so there's a path dependence there where the finance ministry is front and center. And the finance ministry often cares about interest rates, maturity, right? All these details that kind of bring the loan and money into the country. But then when you meet with people from, planning ministries and other executive agencies, there's a lot of concern about classic development issues, right? Like technological transfer. And so I think that to some extent, there's a knowledge of where the negotiations need to be, but there's also an element of the negotiations are sometimes structured loan first based upon macro, yet China's coming into the region on micro, right? And in some ways, there needs to be a rebalancing between micro and macro, particularly in light of that, even these loans that are tied to commodities. We see in a place like Ecuador, they leverage about 4 years, right, of oil sales in order to get these loans. So there's very real costs involved for countries that I think the scale of these costs are similar to the past in some ways, but the ledger is a bit different because it's involving the commodities and the underwriting these deals with commodities.
Hey, Barbara, did you have something to add to that? No. Okay. Another question, and Stephen, this is again taking off from some of your other work and drawing on the comments that Xiaoyu and others have made about Chinese and US involvement in Latin America is seen in the United States principally as a zero-sum game. There is often the response from critics within the United States that the real answer to the concerns about Chinese involvement is for the United States to step up and to offer more in terms of investments and loans and those kinds of things. To what extent does any of you see that likely to happen, to see infrastructure in place, such as the Development Finance Corporation? I mean, to what extent is the United States equipped to compete with China? And I'm going to come back to Francisco, be thinking about what you've said about public opinion about China worse because of the pandemic. Anyway, first question about what should the United States be doing, and is it capable of stepping up?
Let me say a few things about that. I think the United States realizes that it is not capable of competing in any direct way. You mentioned, Cindy, the Development Finance Corporation, which has got a minuscule budget compared to the two policy banks that Stephen focuses on in his book. They're not even in the same league. So what the United States is trying to do, and we don't have a European specialist on here. It'd be interesting to know sort of how they look at this. But the United States is trying to find ways to leverage the private sector to move in and do things which the state, the government can't do because of lack of resources. How effective that's going to be, we don't know. But I think the idea of any kind of direct competition, that nobody in the US government believes that they're in a position to directly challenge China in Latin America. They can huff and puff and say you shouldn't use Huawei and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. In some cases, they've managed to turn back some policies or some projects that China had proposed and that had been accepted. The case of Panama was perhaps the most dramatic. After Panama had decided to become part of the BRI, the AIB was going to be a hub for Latin America and China. Dozens of big projects were negotiated, and the US calls up and says, hey guys, we've got some not direct competition tools, we've got ways of punishing you if you do that. Some people say that the threat of visas being pulled was really an important piece of Panama turning around. In the case of Chile, I mentioned lots of new Chinese investment. One of the biggest projects was supposed to be an underwater cable from Chile to China, financed by China. The Japanese then came in and one way or another, behind the scenes as well as up front, won the bid, and this is now, the cable's now going to Australia, if I'm not mistaken. So the US can do some behind the scenes, still maneuvering and pressuring, but no way can they really directly compete with China in terms of volume of money, leaving aside the conditions that are put on the money.
Do others want to, I see Stephen, go ahead, please.
Sure, just taking the baton and continuing sort of the discussion that Barbara was highlighting is, yeah, I think that in terms of economic competition, it's very difficult for the United States to compete in what this book outlines about China, which is China has a comparative advantage in breaking into new markets, right? They use capital subsidy in order to expand their market share. But what the United States is then trying to do, and rightly so, is sort of leverage the private sector, because the longer standing question is, even though China is very good at breaking into markets, can they sustain markets, right, through private competition or not? And so we see this alive and well in debates like in Ecuador, right, where, you know, Cindy too was highlighting speed and efficiency, right? Barbara was highlighting the speed and efficiency of these projects. And so it's very attractive, right, from a Latin American standpoint, if you're a politician and infrastructure, you know, you have a deficit, it's very attractive. But then, right, at the same time, maybe you push this project through, but then there's long run concerns about the operational capacity of some of these hydroelectric dams. There's questions about the infrastructure, right, cracks in the walls and fissures. And so, you know, I think really the question for the United States is, even if China is very, very capable of breaking into new markets, can the United States be better at sustaining these markets over time? One other, small addendum too, I think Barbara was highlighting technology. I think given this limited capacity, the United States has to choose, right? So they're not going to compete in this big infrastructure sector, generally so, but maybe in things that are more sensitive like telecommunications or technology, we've seen a little more head-to-head competition in a place like Brazil, where the United States is trying to dissuade certain, 5G infrastructure investments with financing and so forth. But ultimately, part of this comes back to capacity, right? And in an area like telecommunications and 5G networks, the United States doesn't have its own company, its own brand in these lines, which makes that competition a little more difficult. But we do see, I think, a little more focus, given these constraints, in sensitive areas such as technology.
That was a question, another question from the audience, from Guillermo Rodriguez. If others want to talk about the tech or the cyber side of the Chinese Latin America relationship, Xiao Yu, if you have anything you want to contribute to this question about, the U.S. versus China, but with specific reference to the tech sector. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to contribute.
Yeah, I think I want to briefly comment about the U.S.-China competition in Latin America. Is that I think ultimately U.S.-China have competitions, but also from U.S. perspective, it's better to think about in a symmetrical way, not like a dollar to dollar, everything match China's scale. Because the United States has its own advantages. So even in infrastructure, I think it's more like China might be good in terms of like a hardware part, but the United States has advantage in some sort of software. That's a metaphor, right? So in terms of legal service, in terms of some other dimensions, I think the United States can compete with China, but also can think about this not in a symmetric competition, but in a more asymmetric way. Think about America's own advantage, but also think about in some issues, it's not always a zero-sum game. Even competitions, sometimes maybe benign competition, sometimes maybe complementary. at least in some aspects. So I think U.S. probably need a more comprehensive understanding how to do that. The second part is regarding Chinese like technology, cyber stuff in Latin America. I think there's some in academic studies, there's some ongoing debate. Some people worry maybe China might export it's this kind of authoritarian model through this technological export. But others think China's main purpose is to make its own domestic political system appear to be more legitimate, primarily for domestic audience. China has no interest to export its model, but some of the technology might have political security implications. So I think no deny about that. So I think there's some reasonable concerns from Latin America government's perspective. But I think from U.S. perspective, it probably won't work. Simply lecture those Latin American countries how you should do business with China. I think ultimately it's these individual countries, their own domestic process, how they calculate benefit risk, how they calculate the different kind of trade-off for these different countries. Yeah.
Question is how, maybe this is best a question for Francisco. To what extent are Latin American governments and or the Latin American private sector thinking in these terms? How much are they, other than when a project comes and parks itself on offer, how much is learning about China and taking part in negotiations, thinking about trade-offs, the kinds of things that Xiaoyu was talking about? What is your impression, Francisco, about how important this kind of thinking is in Latin America or any countries, Chile, whatever countries you?
My sensation, and actually I agree quite a lot with you, is that there's a lot of, well, companies are not well prepared, and there's a sense in the region that countries now are asked to choose whether they are more pro-China or they are more pro-USA. For countries with very intense relations with both, such as Chile, that creates a lot of foreign policy dilemmas that were not experienced before. You mentioned the 5G cable project in Chile. I remember a few years ago, the Chilean president went to Shenzhen to visit Huawei's headquarters, and eventually he did not go to the meeting. He sent middle people from the telecom ministry to avoid bugging the State Department. And that creates a lot of difficulties in political terms in Latin America, because the sensation of having to choose one side or having to have a strategy to manage pressures from both sides is something, in general, I would say foreign affairs ministries are not prepared to. Again, so far it's been past dependence, and everyone capitalized the relation with China because it had pretty low costs and quite a lot of benefits. And more recently, I would say in the last 2 years, the costs are starting to be larger, and these geopolitical costs add to the account. So I don't know. I mean, the future, it will be certainly more challenging for Latin America with regards to how they have positive relations with China and with the US at the same time. I see that very hard to occur.
Great. I'm going to come back to each of you in a minute for one final maximum 1 minute comment of something that a point you've made that you want to drive home, or something that a new point. But I do want to go back to this question of the public opinion regarding China having declined because of the pandemic, because there is an interpretation in the United States that at the outbreak of the pandemic, the Trump administration was not exporting personal protective equipment. It was exporting ventilators. Now the offers of vaccines is greater from the United States, but China was certainly out there visibly, not only in terms of giving PPE to Latin American countries, but also providing vaccines at a lower cost than the United States. And so this was taken as yet another area in which the United States and China were competing for the hearts and minds of Latin Americans. So I would like, Francisco, for you to develop a little bit more why it is during the pandemic you think that opinion vis-a-vis China has suffered.
So I've carried out a few survey experiments and that I haven't published yet, but the story raised by Donald Trump that this was a China's virus really had an impact in the region, and people do still associate China with the pandemic, and for example, the successful role of Chinese vaccines haven't improved China's image in the region, and nor the mask diplomacy. So this seems to be a very damaging effect that will probably last. Why so? Well, I'm still trying to understand the main cause, but I would say that overall Latin Americans feel that their region has been very much harmed by the pandemic. 1 out of 4 dead people is from Latin America, although we are a small percentage of the world's population. And some of the worst economic crises due to COVID have occurred in the region. And unconsciously or consciously, there's always someone to be blamed. And I think that the psychological cue is to put that blame on China. My studies show that this is very intense across countries, across political ideologies. And again, not the vaccine, not the mask diplomacy has done much to improve this. And yeah, that's it. I think that's something that again raises the question of how China's approach to the region will be in the following years. There's more questions than answers in this regard.
Okay, we'll have one final lightning round. We'll go in reverse order. Xiaoyu, you'll go first if you want to make any. It doesn't have to be a summary comment. It can just be one last point that you'd like to leave the audience with. And please unmute.
My final comment is that competitions are real and consequential, but even competitions do not always mean a zero-sum game. So regarding China-Latin American relations, we need a more nuanced understanding of the relationship, how China handled Latin America, how Latin American countries handle China. That will inform the American policy thinking. So that's my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara, next.
Let me take right off from that about the zero-sum aspect of China, Latin America, China, US in the region. Some of you know Zhang Xishui, who organized an online seminar about a year ago on China, Latin America, US relations. And I allowed as how I thought that if Biden won the election, the situation could look quite different, that Biden might have this more nuanced view that Xiaoyu was just talking about, and that there might even be some joint projects. I thought that the environmental area might lend itself. And so I expected us to be in a somewhat different situation right now, a less tense, a more pragmatic, how can we do things to further Latin American development? I'm surprised and disappointed that Biden seems to have followed up on the Trump line with respect to China itself, and also in the Latin American context. So surprised and disappointed at where we are right now.
Great. That takes us to Francisco. Final word to
Many seconds. I think that Stephen's book brings a lesson, which is in Latin America, we should also leave non-state actors to take grip of the relationship with China. Sometimes they do even better than states. So companies, NGOs, and subnational governments should try to have a stronger bond, at least in economic terms, with China to take the best of this relationship.
Super. Stephen, final word.
I think one of the themes coming out of this panel is nuance and pragmatism. And just to kind of highlight, we've shared, right, the idea that the United States is concerned about China's comparative advantage in finance, right, and their ability to break through new markets. But there's also increasing use of competitive bidding, private procurement, not only by multilateral institutions that are Western, but also AIB, and also many national governments, which creates an opportunity. Met with a lot of people in planning ministries, economic ministries, and there are spreadsheets, and it's not just one dimension based upon financing. It cuts across 20, 25 different areas in terms of how they evaluate projects with the most technocratic governments, right? So that creates the opportunity, particularly when a lot of these investments are increasingly becoming more and more sophisticated and needing financial intermediaries, consultants, all these areas of comparative advantage that the United States has. So thank you very much. It's been a terrific panel.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks and congratulations again to Stephen for this book, which took so many years, as we know, a true model of scholarship. Thank you, Barbara, Francisco, Xiaoyu, for joining us from your respective places around the country. Thanks again to Oscar, to our co-sponsors, the Kissinger Institute, Mexico Institute, Brazil Institute, to Treon Burgess and Tracy Fitzgerald of our AV team, Oscar Cruz of the Latin American program. We are finished. Thank you again. Have an excellent weekend. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.